It's an interesting point about talent that I think you framed in a way it was very helpful to think about, that you actually have to be within a couple standard deviations to even appreciate this. And so I think a big problem with a lot of our institutions, for example, around the Pentagon, is if you have people who are only one standard deviation above, they can't even tell a difference between 4 and 5. And they have no idea what's even going on at those levels. So you need people who are good enough to even appreciate that.
We have a huge advantage, and let's just take U.S. commercial. This is a really true thing and really not understood, that to appreciate talent, you need to be within standard deviation of that talent. Unless you have some specialized weird, this is where, for whatever reason, I think I have some kind of weird ability where, I have picked some of the best and managed some of the best engineers in the world consistently. Larger institutions struggle in some cases because they think they can't tell the difference between.
Well, I think it's almost like those cultures reject these people who are extremely good, right?
But again, to your American optimism thing, which I share, and we have a culture that nurtures them, allows them to be managed, provides capital, teaches them. One of the things I think people get wrong is you don't learn to win by failing. You learn to win by working with people who have ups and downs and then win. So there's like a deep understanding, whether they work with you at 8VC or they work with others, some of whom I like and some of whom I don't, but you do learn what it means to build business. And in the American commercial context, especially, you have this high turnover. So it's like people really do, the people running these institutions on the tech side, 5 years ago, CIOs didn't buy our product. Now they do. Because it's there's this plasticity of learning in the US, which is something that I think other countries struggle with. That it is true that identifying the difference between, Bob and Ryan and any very strong normal engineer is something that takes specialized. Quite frankly, I think it's very similar to music. Very few people can hear the blue note. Almost no one can play it. To be what we do in tech is we hear the blue note on the tech talent side, which very few people, it's like you roll 3 crazy people into a room and a very talented normal person will pick the one person who's moderately talented. Whereas if you roll those 3 people into Palantir or to your VC, we'll be like, no, we want that one. And that's great. Then you have to be able to manage that person. That's also...
Basically, that's like my karma to have to manage these people now after you had to deal with us when we were kids. So that's how we're doing it.
Well, I have a lot of stories about our times together. Our times together are some of the best of my life.
Oh. So, Alex, you said you left academia in part because it was a bit self-gratifying, you said earlier. And so obviously you had this skill, you could be a builder. Academia wasn't where you wanted to be. Like how do you transition into the business world?
By the way, this is your podcast about me and not about you. But one of the things I always admired about Joe is the most loyal person on the planet. And sometimes, you have to fight and you're wrong.
You could be loyal and wrong though, too.
No, Joe, it's a lot of our fighting for justice and winning, Joe is spearheaded.
Right.
And
it's been a mistake where I've been too loyal and I've kept people I shouldn't have around in certain positions. It's very hard to get this right. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's a mistake that we all at Palantir enjoyed you having. And our times getting Palantir off the ground were just crazy magical, dangerous, scary. We almost went out of business a lot of times. And in fact, except for the fact that we were so maniacally focused on getting this thing to work, it would never have worked because no one wanted to invest in us. All the top VCs were like, it's a crazy idea to be interested in data, working with large institutions.
We did have a little bit of an attitude that I think you and I shared, which was like the famous, Kid Timus, Caesar Vius, which is, why are you afraid? Like you're carrying the people who are going to be successful, right? To the famous boatman with Julius Caesar. There's something like that, which I don't think it was necessarily arrogance. It was just a sense that we had to win.
Maybe look, I think we were arrogant, but in some ways in some places we were too arrogant. In some places we weren't arrogant enough.
That's fair.
If we had gone into the VCs and been like, "Fuck you, we're going to win," they probably would have given us money.
Do you have any favorite stories from some of those VC meetings?
We had so many, but obviously the most famous.
Too many.
The most famous is we're at like the most famous VC, and like we're in the last round and they're pretty, and the most important partner just like spent his time doodling. My fantasy of it is he was doodling some erotic little picture that he was fixated on, but but in non-fairness to that person, I think if we had stood up and walked out, we're like, fuck this, you guys are wasting our time, chances of them investing would have been much higher. One of the things that entrepreneurs or builders need to understand about the Valley is if you're not overtly aggressive about representing yourself, they'll just assume that it's not real. And we were ironically too modest with those people. However, and then sometimes too arrogant with like government people and others where we're like...
me as a 22-year-old was probably not the right person to sell to the government. That was complicated, but yeah.
But in fairness to us, the government has changed a lot. I mean, there's a lot of problems and I have some ideas of how to fix them, but we were the first to break in. And it's like a lot of other companies have now come in, and some are doing very well.
No, I'm able to do a lot in defense now, thanks to Palantir, and then SpaceX and others, right? And,
we showed up. We succeeded, which again, none of this matters if you're like some academic project, you don't succeed. Yeah. We sued the government not to buy our product, but to ensure that people bought products that worked, because the most important thing, in my view, that can happen for the preservation of the West and its values is for the U.S. military to be by far the best in the world.
What are a couple things they could do to fix it and be better? Obviously, they've changed, they've improved. Like, what do you want to see them do?
They've changed, they've improved. There's just, in business, it's really important to go back to like things that are kind of obvious. But one of the obvious things that's not part of every structure of the U.S. government is almost all enterprise software that works in America or in the world has two characteristics. It's built in America and it's built as a product.
Yep.
And it has a third characteristic, quite frankly, that it's sold commercially. So if you just say, the rebuttable presumption is, if a product is world-class, it is built in America. Again, rebuttable doesn't always mean, but very likely. It is, you could get drilled down on that, it's built by this, but just, it is a product. And somebody commercially has bought that product.
Yeah.
It is very non-plausible that you would have the best software product in the world and you've never sold it commercially because you don't have time to make your company be worth $50 billion. It is not a product. Okay, so that means you will never scale it. And by the way, that also, there's a lot there because you want the world's best engineers to work on something, the ones that can do things no one else can. Tell them you want to not build products and see how far that goes.
Yeah.
And again, for reasons that are complicated and hard to understand, it almost as invariably is built in America, most likely on the West Coast, but not exclusively on the West Coast anymore. Okay, we know this to be true. The U.S. government should have a policy where a small percent of all, especially the DoD, a small percent of its spend has to go to products built in the software built in the United States that is a product that has been proven both on the battlefield and has been in some derivative sold commercially.
But the insiders are all doing like cost plus contracts, right? And they're still doing that.
If you want to reform an institution, you've got to start by reforming parts of it. So I would just say, starting now, 1% has to go for this. 1% of $900 billion was roughly the budget. It's like, and then every 6 months, it goes up by 1%. Or you could even say every year, because in the end, and by the way, that would change the number of people selling to the DoD, because even now, I'm sure there are like a lot more people. When we were building Palantir, I'm glad the VCs have changed. I'm glad the culture in Silicon Valley now can either be interested in helping the DoD or as likely pretend they're interested. But in fairness, one of the things that stops even more investment is there's these long time cycles, and it's not clear that your product isn't going to be outbought by someone providing a service. By the way, services things tend not to work.
Early on, when we were trying to sell the government, the services things would capture like the vast majority of the revenue, and they'd toss us like a really tiny piece, and that was the only way you get in.